Hello students, welcome to the lecture again. Today, in the continuation with the previous two lectures, I am going to discuss the topic pollination. You are very much aware about this word pollination because you have studied this pollination in the class 10th part also. So I am explaining this term pollination in a detailed manner. The word pollination means the transfer of the pollen grain from anther to the stigma. So in previous lecture I told you what is the anther and what is the stigma. So anther is the male part of the flower and stigma is the female part of the flower, which means in this mechanism in the pollination, the male part, the male structure of the flower is traveling from the male side to the female side. So in this diagram you can see this is the male part of the flower and this is the female part, this is female part and this is also female part. So in this pollination the male part, the anther, is moving, is traveling from its own side to the female side. Okay, so in the next slide, I will explain you what are the different types of pollination. Basically, there are three types of pollination: autogamy, geitonogamy, and xenogamy. Right? So let's discuss one by one. First is autogamy. The word auto, which means itself. So this autogamy is also known as self-pollination. Right, in the previous classes you have just studied about the two types of pollination, self and cross. So this autogamy is the type of self pollination. So in this type of pollination, the anther, the male part, transfer to the stigma within the same flower. So in this slide you can see this is the anther, the male part of the flower, and this is the stigma, the female reproductive structure of the flower. So the condition for the self-pollination, the condition for the autogamy, the flower must be bisexual. Bisexual means the flower contain both sexual structure, male as well as female. So in this self-pollination, the anther transfer from the pollen grain is transferred from the anther to the stigma, right? So in this autogamy, these flowers must have synchronization with each other. Means these flowers have a synchronization between the stigma and the anther, the male and the female part of the flower. Because if they are not having the receptivity, then the stigma will not easily catch the pollen grain. Right? So move to the next slide. Autogamy further contain two types of flower. One is the chasmogamous flower and another is the clistogamous flower. So chasmogamous flower means those flower which are similar to the flower of other species and they are having the exposed anther and the stigma, which means they are the open type of flowers. So in this slide you can see the chasmogamous flower are the open flower. Open means they are having exposed anther and the stigma. Right. Second type of flower is the clistogamous flower. So clistogamous flower means the closed flower. So you can see they are the closed flower. They do not open at all. So the anther and the stigma, they are lying close to each other inside the flower, right? So they are truly autogamous in nature because they anther and the stigma are not exposing to the air, not exposing to any surrounding. So that's why they always meet with each other to fulfill the mechanism of the pollination. So the clistogamous flower produce assured seed set even in the absence of pollinator, which means these clistogamous flowers do not require any agent of the pollination. right? They do not require any living and non-living agent for the pollination because they are the self-pollinator, right? So clistogamous flower leads to finally in inbreeding depression. So in class 11th, I think you have studied about the inbreeding depression, which means the quality of the breed decreasing continuously. That is the inbreeding depression, and it is due to the continuous self-pollination. Move to the next part. Next type of pollination is the Geitonogamy. So Geitonogamy is a type of cross-pollination in which the pollen grain transfer from the anther to the stigma of another flower within the same plant. So in this slide you can see, okay, this is the plant and this plant is having two flowers. So pollen grain from this flower is transferring to the stigma of the different flower. So this type of pollination is known as Geitonogamy, right? So it is functionally a cross pollination which requires some pollinating agent, because these pollen grains are require some agent by which they can transfer from the one flower to the another flower. Move to the next part, that is the xenogamy. So xenogamy, this is also a type of cross-pollination in which the transfer of pollen grain from one plant to another plant. Now you can see, okay, these are the two plants and these two plants are having flower. So the from the plant 1, pollen grain from the plant 1 travel to the stigma of the plant 2. So this type of pollination is known as xenogamy. Okay. Now I will explain you what are the agents of pollination. Basically, there are two agents of pollination. In fact, the abiotic agent and biotic agent. So abiotic and biotic. Abiotic simply means non-living agent. So it includes all type of non-living agent which help in the transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma. But biotic, it is the living component, living agent, living organism which help in the pollination. So let's start with the abiotic agent. So abiotic agent, the first abiotic agent is wind. Wind is non-living component, and the pollination that caused by the wind is known as anemophily, which means that when the wind helps in the pollination, then this mechanism is known as anemophily. So this is the most common abiotic agent for all type of terrestrial plant, means the plant which grow on the land. So by the action of the wind, the pollinated flower having a pollen grain which travel through the wind and reaches to the compatible stigma for the further mechanism of the fertilization. So here I'm showing you some example like the corn cob. So corn cob, here the tassel, the tassel are the stigma, and style which wave in the wind to trap the pollen grain. So this portion is waving in the wind, and by this action they catches more and more pollen grain for the further process. And the wind pollination is also very common in the grasses, because grasses are having very small, very light, minute size of pollen grain, so they can easily they can easily transfer from the anther to the stigma. Move ahead with the wind part. So ways for the effective pollination are the flower produce large amount of pollen grain, and these pollen grain are light, minute and non-sticky. So these pollen grain are easily received by the stigma, because stigma are the large and feathery. So they can easily trap the pollen grain which are traveling in the air. Next abiotic agent is the water. So pollination which is regulated by the water is known as hydrophily. The word hydro means water, which means कि when the water is causing pollination, then it is known as hydrophily. This type of pollination is not a very common mechanism. It is quite rare because it just occur only in the aquatic plant and those plants which are growing near the water body. So some of the examples of the uh, water pollination is a Vallisneria, Hydrilla, the Zostera, they all are the aquatic plants. So these plants produces their pollen grain. So if we talk about the Vallisneria, now in this flower you can say if male flower is present below the water body, means submerged in the water body, while the female flower is present at the surface of the water body. So male flower produces pollen grain. So this is producing pollen grain and these pollen grain reaches up to the female flower, means reaches at the surface of the flower, right? In the second part, if we talk about the sea grasses, in this system it is just opposite. The male part is at the surface of the water body while the female part is um, submerged inside the water. So in this case the pollen grain is like a ribbon type which reaches to the female part, that is the stigma. So this water pollination is very common in the bryophytes and the pteridophytes because bryophyte and pteridophyte they use water medium for the external fertilization as well as for the pollination. Okay, so Vallisneria and seagrass I have already explained to you. Then move to the next slide. Now, in case of the water pollination, the pollen grains of the most of the water pollinated species have a mucilaginous covering. Means this covering protect the pollen grain from the wetting. Means it is just a protective layer. Okay. So not all the aquatic plants use this hydrophily mechanism. But in most of the aquatic plants, water hyacinth, water lily, the flower emerge above the level of water. So you can see this is the water hyacinth, this is the water lily. The flower are emerging above the level of water and these flower support the entomophily or the anemophily. Anemophily, I have already explained to you the pollination which is regulated by the wind. But entomophily, when the insects, when the biotic agent help in the pollination. Now move towards the next part, biotic agent, the animals. So majority of the flowering plant use this uh, living agent pollination, biotic agent pollination, such as the bee, butterfly, beetle, wasp, moth, birds, rodents, etc., etc. So these organisms, these insect and animals just help in the pollination, the transfer of the pollen grain from anther to stigma. So when the pollination is caused by the insect, it is known as entomophily, right? So in this entomophily, bee is the most common insect which help in the pollination. Now, features of the insect pollinated flower. So, insect pollinated flower, the feature means it must be a very bright, colorful, fragrant, rich in nectar. So, the insect came close to all these type of flowers for the search of nectar, and they carry pollen grain and transfer from the male part to the female part. Some small flower from the inflorescence to make them visible, which means some flowers are very small but they are arranged in such a manner which attract more and more insects, right? The flower pollinated by the flies, beetles, and they secrete full order to attract all these animals, right? And these pollen grains are generally very sticky in nature. Okay, so in this slide you can see this is the example where bee, the insect, is help in the pollination of the flower. So when the animal comes in contact with the anther and the stigma, its body gets pollen grain like the legs, the wings. They catch the pollen grain and transfer from the anther to the stigma. So friends, this is all about the agents of